It was a dangerous mission, for any man trying it had run up the bare face of the hill while 20 or 25 police were firing at him from 250 yards range. He was carrying a shotgun and haversack. I got him to wait until the police fired one of their volleys and then bolt for it. He was on his toes behind the fence, and as soon as the volley rang out, he was away up the hill. The police fire lifted immediately as they tried to get him going up the hill, and I held my breath.
During 1919, and even before that, violence against members of the Crown Forces and their supporters was increasing. By the summer of 1920, it was clear that the answer of the British government was going to be repression in terms of the demands of Irish Republicans. Early on in that year, reprisals by members of the Crown Forces against Republicans and also against the broader community in general in Republican areas had begun. By the summer and by the autumn of 1920, they were increasingly common and increasingly brutal.
Along with the 30 others who were present, I joined and received my first instructions in drill. I was 15 years at the time. As the AOH-IAA was proclaimed in 1916, there was no further volunteer activity until 1917, when PJ McDonnell revived the Lannan Company again, and, if I remember rightly, he organised and got other companies going in adjacent areas. These were later grouped together and formed into a battalion of the Galway Brigade, with PJ McDonnell as Battalion OC.
In the autumn of 1920, Dick Mulcahy, who was the Chief of Staff of the IRA, was approached by PJ McDonnell, a prominent local IRA officer. He was asked, essentially, to get rid of this unwieldy county-based brigade structure. Connemara was divided into the East and West Connemara brigade areas. McDonnell became the officer commanding. He became the commandant of the West Connemara brigade.
My father used to talk a lot about the War of Independence and did you know your grandfather was in it, but I didn't understand the significance or what that meant, but I was aware that he was involved and I'd seen pictures of him with medals. So I just, he fought in the war. He fought for the 4th Western Division IRA in Galway, and he was involved in quite a few ambushes and quite a few serious incidents and skirmishes with the Black and Tans, and he was the chief marksman of his brigade, and I believe from some of the records it's clear that he was quite a dead shot. When you were with him, he was never one for big stories or big talking, but he was always so immaculately dressed. He always had his shirt and tie on. You always felt the certain strength, had kind of an aura from him, that there was a calmness about him, and you could tell by him he really enjoyed being around his grandchildren, which we were, and his wider family. I always felt, certainly as I got older and before he died, that he had a real sense of place and a love of community.
Well, Colm O'Geara was my granduncle. He was my mother's uncle, and my mother talked about him a lot at the time and talked about the War of Independence, and especially the Flying Column. She could reel off the names of most of the people in the Flying Column when we were children. She would name PJ McDonnell, who led the Flying Column, and Jack Feehan and King and George Stanton and the rest. Even on her deathbed, she told us about Pádraig Pearse coming to Rossmuck and how Colm O'Geara got to know him and visited him quite a bit in the cottage there in Rossmuck. So Colm was appointed as an organiser in Connacht, and of course he was part of the IRA reorganisation and so on and so forth. And then he was OC in that area of Rossmuck. He was captured in Mayo, brought to Dublin and sentenced to 15 years. 15 years in English jail, and he knew the people over there. He knew De Valera in jail and so on, you know, so it connected me very clearly with Irish history, which meant then that I could follow up and do a little bit of research on my own when I grew older, and it was a proud thing in the family, you know. Very proud of Colm O'Guire and the War of Independence and the Flying Column.
The brutality that they wrought on villages and towns after every event or insurrection.
Houses were being burnt on a regular basis. It was very, very likely that members of the families would be targeted.
The fear they had of reprisals from the Black and Tans, and the ultimate knowledge that if they were captured, that was it, they would have been shot on the spot.
I was made prisoner by the British military in a roundup which took place very shortly after the ambush at Mount Tyrone. I had come home for one night and was captured at home.
They had difficulties recruiting policemen in Ireland, and they knew that they weren't going to be able to recruit enough policemen in Ireland to counteract a genuinely popular revolutionary movement in Sinn Féin and the IRA. So they began to recruit in Britain for the RIC. Because of a shortage of uniforms, these men were known as Black and Tans. Now, they would have been scattered all over the country to police barracks all over the country. Now, later a force called the Auxiliary Division of the RIC is sent in. They're of a much higher calibre in terms of fighting than the Black and Tans. They tend to be ex-British Army officers, for example. They're garrisoned together in units in areas where the IRA was strong. They're independent of any other forces, and they're allowed essentially get on with trying to crush the IRA using any method that they deem fit. The Black and Tans and the Auxies did an awful lot of damage to the reputation of the British government.
There was an ambush at Scrieb in 1921, and the following day retaliation happened and 5 houses were burned. And of course Colm O'Guire's house, which was just beside my mother's house, was burned to the ground, and the RIC and the Black and Tans came in, and she could recreate the scene where they came in. Where's your father? Where's your father? Where's your father?
How terrifying it must have been for those guys, because they were essentially homeless. They lived in the hills. They were dependent on the goodwill of the Irish citizens, who also took serious risks in harbouring them or giving them shelter. Particularly, in essence, the brutality of the Black and Tans at the time, and how they reacted to, you know, the Irish Army, or the IRA as they were known at the time. And I think it would have been a very hard life for those guys at that time, all of it, because, you know, they would have been together 24/7 and living a very hard life, fighting a very difficult conflict.
When the Clifton contingent and their escorts arrived at Annan on their return from the fight, they halted and went into the 2 public houses, one of which belonged to my sister, Mrs. D. Cuff. After a few drinks, they apparently got their courage back and decided to burn my house and workshops in the village. Also Mrs. Cuff's house, as she was my sister. They actually had the tins of petrol out of the lorries, but after a great deal of persuasion were prevented by their officer, District Inspector Golden, who had previously been stationed in the district as a sergeant and was friendly.
When these men joined the Flying Column in 1921, for example, they would have known that it was very, very likely that members of their families would be targeted for reprisals in the event of being captured themselves. There was a strong likelihood of being shot, maybe in the immediate aftermath of battle.
I was taken to Mom RIC barracks, where I was badly beaten. Shots were fired over my head. Pins were driven into my skin, and all sorts of threats used by the RIC to make me tell the whereabouts of my brother John C. Towards the evening, after a day of torture, the RIC named Milan came to me in my cell and said that later on, when all the other RIC and TANs would get drunk, he would help me to escape through the back gate. This Constable Milan had at one time been friendly with my uncle. He was as good as his word, and in spite of all the beatings and tortures, I got away from the place very quickly and swore that I would never be caught again.
Attacks on the Crown Forces were often initially motivated by desires of revenge. This is something that we see in West Connemara. A member of the Irish Volunteers, a member of the IRA called Tommy Whelan, who was living and working in Dublin, had been executed for his alleged part in the Bloody Sunday shootings of November 1920. Now, Whelan was innocent, and it was locally felt that he was innocent. PJ McDonnell and the IRA leadership in Connemara was able to use the death of Whelan in order to harden hearts and steel men towards shooting people at close range in an attack on the RIC in Clifton in March 1921, in the days following the execution of Tommy Whelan in Dublin by the British. The IRA got word that there was a patrol of 4 RIC men in Clifton. They sent a group of 6 to attack the 4. Another group was detailed to attack the RIC barracks in Clifton in order to give the 6 a chance to escape. Now, by the time they came into contact with the patrol, it diminished to 2 members of the RIC, and they were shot.
When we got to the patrol, we found only 2 RIC men and no black and tans. The 2 men were killed, and a Lee Enfield and 2 Webley revolvers captured.
Tommy Whelan in Clifton was hanged, and they retaliated and shot 2 policemen in Clifton. And then they went across the hills in the middle of March to North Connemara, through North Connemara. Now, Colm O'Guire was very sick in bed that day, so PJ McDonnell came in and said, "Okay, we have to get you out of here tonight, because there will be retaliation in the morning."
Immediately after the attack on the patrol in Clifton, messages were flashed by the RIC from the Marconi station at Ballinaboy to London. They were relayed from there to Galway. Big reinforcements of RIC and British forces came by rail and road from Galway to Clifton.
It was from Marconi wireless station that the call for reinforcements was sent to Galway. All wires connecting the town with the outside world had been cut. When we were far on in the mountains, we saw the lights of a train passing onto Clifton, and shortly after we heard the sound of gunfire and saw the sky redden with the blaze of burning houses. There were 13 houses burned in Clifton on that night, and 1 man was shot through the mouth by the auxiliaries who made up the reinforcements.
Over the course of St. Patrick's Night of 1921, there's massive reprisals in Clifton. A large number of houses and businesses are attacked and destroyed by members of the Crown Forces.
We made our HQ at Padraig O'Malley's house in Mount Rowan. Firing positions were laid out around the house and on the cliff at the rear. In the event of an attack, we all knew where to take up our allotted positions.
They knew that they'd been in the area long enough that the house was going to be raided by members of the Crown Forces. Rather than withdraw, they decided that this was likely going to be the only opportunity that they got for a while to come into contact with the Crown Forces.
As day after day went by and nothing happened, we began to lose faith in the information and believe it was a rumour started to frighten us out of the district. I thought I was only a few minutes asleep when I felt someone shaking my shoulder. I opened an eye and saw Mick Conroy, the officer of the guard, beside the bed. I asked if anything was wrong, and he replied that there was a crowd of dark objects coming along the road from Mam. I had no difficulty in identifying the group as police. The arrangement was to let the police approach the house, and, at a given signal, fire was to be opened. But this was not to be. While the main body of the RIC was assembling on the road, a small party of 3 or 4 began to negotiate the stepping stones. At that particular moment a shot rang out. I imagine it was accidentally fired by one of the RIC. Then, almost immediately, another shot rang out on my right. It came from one of the column. Whether it was accidental or not, I don't know. Certainly it changed the whole position. What should have been a fight of probably half an hour could now last for 11 hours.
The morning and the day wore on with very little change in the position.
Now, a sympathetic policeman fired a warning shot. This was replied to, and it actually stopped them really having a successful ambush. There was maybe an 11 or 12-hour gun battle that was, that flickered in terms of intensity. Several attempts were made to outflank the RIC. Christy Breen himself was used to snipe suspected members of the RIC.
Christy Breen, a rifleman, was in position. He saw a figure in black get out of the car, and due to visibility and being 600, 700 yards away, he took him to be a policeman. He put his rifle to his shoulder and fired. His shot must have been very close as his target dived into a ditch on the roadside. Now that the police were dug in, they could hold out for a long time. Also, there was the possibility that other parties might be crossing the mountain and get us in the rear. The OC anticipated this. I therefore called John Dundas, Adjutant Roundstone Battalion, whom I knew to be fearless, and I told him what I suspected and what I wanted him to do. It was a dangerous mission, for any man trying it had run up the bare face of the hill while 20 or 25 police were firing at him from 250 yards range. He was carrying a shotgun and haversack. I got him to wait until the police fired one of their volleys and then bolt for it. He was on his toes behind the fence, and as soon as the volley rang out, he was away up the hill. The police fire lifted immediately as they tried to get him going up the hill, and I held my breath as I saw sods being lifted at his heels and all around him. He, however, arrived safely at the crest, and then, instead of diving over into safety, he deliberately turns around and thumbs his nose at the police and shouted the traditional, which was, however, drowned in rifle fire.
Their luck was in, however, for a man named Francis Joyce of Linan came from that direction in a Ford motor car with 2 workmen. One of the RIC jumped on the running board of the car, threatening Joyce with a revolver to keep going as fast as he could. This RIC man was wounded while on the running board, but he succeeded in getting to Mom RIC Barracks and to Mom Cross Post Office, from where he telephoned to Galway for reinforcements.
A force of police was sent forward against the house from the front, supported by rifle and machine gun fire. This was done in rushes until they got close to the house, and then they started lobbing grenades in the windows.
The reinforcements comprised an armoured car and 13 lorry loads of RIC and British military.
When the auxiliaries came out, or the Black and Tans or whoever from Galway, they had vanished up through the hills.
After seeing the departure of the lorries, we continued across the mountains westward.
Some of my old comrades of the IRA are now gone to their reward. Some are in exile and scattered to the 4 winds of the world. They were fine boys and loyal comrades, but the cause for which they fought is still there with the fight unfinished. I pray God to have mercy on my dead comrades, and I pray that Ireland will yet have her freedom as Pearse wanted it. Not merely free, but Gaelic as well. Not Gaelic merely, but free as well.
He never really spoke about it. It's kind of, you found all these things out afterwards. He didn't give a witness statement. He didn't take the pension that the state offered to all of the volunteers that fought. So you could say he wanted to depart it. He wanted to remove himself for it. He moved from Galway to Dublin. So I'm sure he carried really, quite deep scars from that, as I'm sure all the individuals individuals did that were involved.
Once you go beyond a limited number of aspects of any conflict or any topic in history, much less is known both by the broader community, but also as well by historians, in terms of certain aspects of any particular period tend to attract attention. And that's the inevitable nature of history, that the military dimension always attracts attention. But over the last over the last 2 decades, much more has been written about other aspects of the War of Independence and the Civil War in the 1916 period. That's one of the benefits of centenaries. People have a tendency to focus on a particular aspect of history on the 100th anniversary, much more than they did on the 90th or the 80th anniversary. And the attention and the work being carried out by local committees, by local historians, by academics, reaching out to local communities, often instigated by people from the ground up, is of benefit both to our collective understanding as historians and as people involved in history, but also as well as a society and a people.
When my grandfather died in 1985, he was buried in Glasnevin Cemetery, and he was awarded a full gun salute from the Irish Army in recognition of his involvement and his efforts during the War of Independence. I remember them all standing behind the armies, and you could tell obviously by the way they were poised and their heads held high, it was an enormously proud moment for them. My father, who's a metal fabricator by trade, went around and picked up all the bullet casings, and when he went back to his job and into his factory where he worked, he created this memento of the actual bullets that were used during the gun salute, and he put them on a stand, and he made one for all of his family, which basically reads Christopher Green, 4th Western Division, IRA, Galway, War of Independence, 1919 to 21. So, you understood what it meant to him, that he would do that. And I remember, I was 15, I think, at the time, seeing him going around and picking them up and wondering, well, why is he doing that? Like, why does he want to do that? And when he did bring these home and produce them, just kind of being amazed and really then understanding how important it was to him, and obviously how important it was to him to mark it, and to have something to remember it by.
With deep pride. I mean, they were the people who set up the state, or who fought for the state. Like every other country in the world, we should commemorate our patriots.
Everybody's connected. Most people on this island have a connection, and a lot of people may not even know it, but we all have relatives, and it's why the Black and Tans, what they did, all of those things still resonate in our society. For all of us, for all the people here, and as we celebrate the centenary this year, we should all try and understand that connection, that we're all part of it, and we should be very, very proud of what our forefathers and grandparents and great-grandparents did during this period. Not just the guys that might have fought, but the households, the men, the women, the wives, the mothers that sheltered them, because the nation fought, not just these guys.